The Vexthul had ruled the galaxy for 17,000 standard cycles, and in all that time not a single law had been broken. Not one regulation had been bent. Not a single exception had ever been made to any rule, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. Their crystalline cities stretched across 47 worlds, each building placed with mathematical precision, each street laid out according to the grand architecture that had been designed millennia ago. Every Vexthul citizen knew their place, their function, their exact purpose in the vast machine of their civilization. They woke at the designated time, performed their assigned tasks with perfect efficiency, consumed their allocated nutrition, and retired at the prescribed moment. Deviation was not just discouraged. It was literally impossible for them to conceive. High Arbiter Zixtal stood before the Grand Council Chamber's viewing wall, watching the geometric patterns of their homeworld's capital city below. Each light, each movement, each tiny speck of activity followed the predetermined paths that had been calculated and recalculated by their ancestors. Perfect order, perfect compliance, perfect emptiness. The thought struck him like a physical blow, and he quickly pushed it away. Such thoughts were not permitted, even for a High Arbiter, especially for a High Arbiter. "The human delegation has arrived," announced Third Arbiter Nixvel, her voice carrying the same monotone inflection that all Vexthul used for official communications. "They await your directive in Docking Bay 247 Alpha." Zixtal turned from the viewing wall, his silver robes rustling with the measured movements that had been drilled into him since hatching. The humans. These strange, chaotic beings from a small blue world on the galaxy's outer rim had been causing complications for nearly 6 cycles now. When the Vexthul first encountered humanity, their initial response had been simple: integrate them into the galactic order. Every species eventually learned to follow the laws. Every species eventually understood that chaos led only to suffering, that order brought peace, that compliance ensured survival. The Vexthul had brought this understanding to over 300 species across the galaxy. But humans were different. "Brief me again on their latest violations," Zixtal commanded as he walked through the pristine corridors toward the docking bay. "Colony ship Endeavor diverted from its assigned colonization target to rescue survivors from the Kepler mining disaster, despite explicit instructions to maintain course," Nixvel recited from her memory banks. Captain Sarah Chen cited moral obligation as justification. Continue. Trading Vessel Horizon negotiated a deal with the Zephyrian Trade Collective that exceeded authorized parameters by 40%, claiming better opportunities for both sides. And Research Station Apollo 7 shared classified terraforming data with the Deltan Republic without proper authorization channels, stating it would help them build better homes for their children. Zixtal felt that strange sensation again, something his species had no word for, because they had bred it out of themselves millennia ago. If he had been human, he might have called it frustration, or perhaps something deeper, something like envy. They reached the docking bay, where the human delegation waited. Zixtal had met with human representatives dozens of times over the past 6 cycles, and each encounter left him more unsettled than the last. The humans stood clustered together, another violation of proper diplomatic protocols, which required single-file formations with appropriate spacing. They spoke in hushed tones, their faces animated with expressions that changed from moment to moment. One of them was actually laughing, a sound that echoed strangely in the sterile environment of the Vexthul facility. "High Arbiter," said Ambassador Elena Rodriguez, stepping forward with that peculiar human gesture of extending her hand. Against all protocols, Zixtal found himself clasping it briefly, another tiny violation that he couldn't quite explain. "Ambassador Rodriguez, you have come to address the mounting violations of your species. Actually, We've come to talk about something more fundamental than that. Elena's dark eyes held something that made Zixtal want to step backward. It wasn't hostility. He understood hostility and could respond to it according to established procedures. This was something else. Something alive and unpredictable. Please clarify. We want to formally request withdrawal from the Galactic Compliance Accord. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. In 17,000 cycles, no species had ever requested withdrawal from the Accord. It was unthinkable. The Accord was what separated civilization from chaos, order from destruction, peace from war. That is not possible, Zixtal said, though even as he spoke the words, he felt something crack inside his certainty. The Accord maintains galactic stability. Without universal compliance, without it, we'll be free to be ourselves. Elena's voice carried something that Zixtal recognized but couldn't name. High Arbiter, with respect, your system is suffocating us. We're not built for this level of control. We're explorers, innovators, problem solvers. We see a situation that needs fixing, and we fix it. We see people who need help, and we help them. We see opportunities for something better, and we reach for them. Such impulses lead to chaos. Sometimes, but they also lead to growth, to discovery, to connections we never expected. Elena gestured to her team. Do you know why our rescue of the Kepler mining survivors was a violation? Because we weren't supposed to care about people who weren't our responsibility. Do you know why our trade deal was excessive? Because we weren't supposed to worry about whether our partners benefited as much as we did. Do you know why sharing our terraforming data was unauthorized? Because we weren't supposed to care about Deltan children we'd never met. Zixtal felt something stirring in his consciousness that had been dormant for so long he'd forgotten it existed. You speak of caring as if it were a virtue. Isn't it? The question was simple, but it struck at the foundation of everything Zixtal had been taught. Caring led to unpredictability. Unpredictability led to chaos. Chaos led to suffering. This was the fundamental logic of Vexthul's civilization. But looking at these humans, at their animated faces, their easy camaraderie, their obvious affection for each other, Zixtal couldn't see suffering. He saw something else. Something that his species had lost so long ago that they'd forgotten it had ever existed. The Council will never approve withdrawal, he said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. Then we'll leave anyway, Elena said quietly. We're not going to stop being human just to fit into your system. We'll pack up our colonies, take our ships, and find somewhere else to call home. Somewhere we can rescue people who need rescuing, make deals that benefit everyone involved, and share knowledge because it's the right thing to do. For the first time in his existence, Zixtal found himself considering something that went against every law, every regulation, every fundamental principle of his civilization. He found himself wondering what it would be like to live without the crushing weight of absolute order. The meeting concluded with the standard diplomatic pleasantries, but as the human delegation prepared to leave, Elena approached Zixtal one final time. High Arbiter, she said quietly. Can I ask you something? You may inquire. When was the last time you did something just because you wanted to? Not because it was required or optimal or efficient, but because it felt right to you personally? The question hit Zixtal like a physical blow. He stared at Elena, his mind racing through cycles of memories, searching for any moment when he had acted on personal desire rather than obligation. There was nothing. His entire existence had been a series of predetermined actions, each one flowing logically from the last, each one justified by the greater good of galactic order. I do not understand the question, he said finally. Elena's expression softened with something that looked almost like pity. I know, she said, and I'm sorry for that. As the human delegation departed, Zixtal remained in the docking bay long after protocol dictated he should return to his duties. He watched their ship disappear into the star field, carrying with it people who somehow managed to care about strangers, to sacrifice efficiency for compassion, to choose growth over safety. For the first time in his life, High Arbiter Zixtal wondered if the Vex Thul had chosen the wrong path. The thought was so heretical that it should have triggered immediate mental conditioning protocols. Instead, it settled into his consciousness like a seed finding fertile ground. Over the following cycles, Zixtal found himself monitoring human activities with increasing fascination. Reports flooded in of more violations. Human doctors providing free medical care to alien refugees despite regulations against unauthorized aid. Human engineers sharing improved shield technology with species facing pirate attacks. Human artists creating collaborative works with alien cultures despite restrictions on cross-cultural contamination. Each violation should have triggered standard enforcement procedures. Instead, Zixtal found himself delaying action, requesting additional data, seeking clarification on protocols that had never required clarification before. "Sir," Nixvel approached him during one of these delays, "the Council has noted irregularities in your processing of human violations. Are you experiencing malfunction?" The word malfunction should have prompted immediate self-diagnostic procedures. Instead, Zixtal found himself considering whether what he was experiencing could be called malfunction or awakening. "No malfunction," he said carefully. "I am gathering comprehensive data before proceeding." It was not entirely untrue, but it was not entirely honest either. Another small violation in a growing pattern of small violations that seemed to be spreading through his thoughts like cracks in crystal. The pattern culminated when reports arrived of the Deltan Republic successfully terraforming 3 previously uninhabitable worlds using modified human technology. The data showed population growth, economic development, and, most troubling of all, measurable increases in what human reports termed happiness indices. Happiness, another concept his species had abandoned in favor of efficiency. Zixtal accessed the full files on human civilization, studying their chaotic history with growing amazement. Wars, yes, but also extraordinary acts of heroism. Conflicts, but also unprecedented cooperation across differences. Mistakes, failures, catastrophes, but also art, music, stories that somehow managed to capture the indefinable essence of what it meant to be alive rather than merely functional. He studied their literature and found beings who struggled with doubt, who made errors, who hurt each other and then forgave each other, who died for strangers and lived for love. He studied their history and found a species that had somehow thrived on the very chaos that Vex Thul civilization was designed to prevent. The final piece fell into place when he accessed recordings from human ships during their various violations. He watched Captain Chen's face as she ordered her ship to divert for the rescue mission, saw the way her eyes brightened when she spoke about saving lives. He listened to the laughter of human traders as they celebrated deals that benefited everyone involved. He observed human scientists sharing their excitement about discoveries that could help alien children they would never meet. These humans weren't just violating regulations, they were happy, genuinely, demonstrably happy in a way that Zixtal began to realize his species hadn't been for millennia. The realization came to him slowly, then all at once, like a revelation that had been building in the background of his consciousness for cycles. The Vex Thul had achieved perfect order by sacrificing everything that made life worth living. Standing again before the viewing wall of his city, watching the geometric perfection of his civilization, Zixtal finally understood what he was seeing. It wasn't order, it was death. A beautiful, efficient, perfectly regulated death that had been consuming his species so slowly that they hadn't noticed they'd stopped truly living. The humans, with all their chaos and unpredictability, were vibrantly, messily, wonderfully alive. For the first time in 17,000 cycles, a Vexthul High Arbiter made a decision based not on regulation, not on efficiency, not on the greater good of galactic order, but on something much simpler and much more profound. He decided to do what felt right. The implications of that decision would reshape the galaxy. The Grand Council chamber had not seen such disorder in recorded history. For 3 days, heated debate had raged through the crystalline halls of Vexthul governance, shattering the serene silence that had prevailed for millennia. High Arbiter Zixtal stood before the 7 Supreme Arbiters. His silver robes no longer perfectly pressed, his posture less rigidly controlled than regulations required. The changes were subtle, but in a society where perfection was mandatory, subtle changes were seismic events. You propose to grant the humans complete exemption from all galactic compliance accords, Supreme Arbiter Kelthar stated, her crystalline voice carrying harmonics of disbelief. This is unprecedented, impossible, chaos incarnate. It is necessary, Zixtal replied, and even he could hear the difference in his own voice. Where once there had been monotone precision, now there were inflections, emotions seeping through like water through cracks in stone. The evidence is irrefutable. Human compliance with our systems reduces their effectiveness by 73%. Their natural behaviors, when unrestrained, produce superior outcomes across all measured parameters. Superior by whose definition? Supreme Arbiter Veldun interjected. Their methods are unpredictable, inefficient, emotionally driven, and more successful than ours have been in 3,000 cycles, Zixtal interrupted, feeling something surge through him that might have been passion. The Deltan terraforming project succeeded because humans shared technology based on compassion rather than treaty obligations. The Kepler rescue saved 847 lives that our protocols would have sacrificed to maintain shipping schedules. The trade agreements have produced economic growth that our regulated exchanges haven't achieved in decades. Supreme Arbiter. Lixdal's form shimmered with agitation. You speak as if success can be measured solely by crude material outcomes. What of order? What of stability? What of the peace that our regulations have maintained for 17 millennia? Zixtal felt something crystallize in his thoughts, a clarity that came not from perfect logic, but from something deeper. What peace, Supreme Arbiter? What we call peace is merely the absence of visible conflict. But look at our populations. Look at our innovation rates. Look at our birth statistics, our art production, our genuine scientific discoveries. We haven't grown in 12,000 cycles. We've simply maintained. Maintenance is stability. Stability is survival. Survival is not the same as living. The words hung in the chamber like a condemnation. Around the council table, the 7 Supreme Arbiters flickered with uncertainty, an emotion so foreign to their kind that their bioluminescent forms couldn't properly express it. High Arbiter Zixtal, Supreme Arbiter Mexthor spoke with the voice of final authority. You are proposing to abandon the fundamental principles that have governed galactic civilization since before recorded history. The consequences could be catastrophic. The consequences of maintaining our current path are already catastrophic, Zixtal replied. We're dying, Supreme Arbiters. Not quickly, not violently, but slowly and completely. We're becoming relics in our own galaxy, while younger species surpass us not through superior technology or greater resources, but through the simple willingness to grow and change and make mistakes, and learn from them. He moved to the central holographic display, calling up data streams he had been analyzing for cycles. Observe the human colonies. Their populations show consistent growth not just in numbers, but in diversity of thought, innovation, artistic expression. Compare this to our own worlds, where the last significant cultural development occurred 4,000 cycles ago. The data was undeniable. Human settlements, despite their supposed chaos, showed vitality indices that Vex-Thul civilization hadn't achieved since their earliest historical records. But more than that, they showed something the Arbiters barely had words for: joy. They create music spontaneously, Zixtal continued, his voice gaining strength. They form attachments that transcend biological necessity. They risk their lives for strangers. They dream of futures that don't yet exist and then work to make them real. When was the last time any of us dreamed of something that wasn't already planned and approved and calculated to 17 decimal places? Supreme Arbiter Kelvex spoke quietly. Dreams are inefficient. They lead to disappointment, to wasted resources, to life. Zixtal finished. Dreams lead to life, Supreme Arbiter. And we have forgotten how to live. The chamber fell silent except for the humming of the regulation environmental systems. Each of the 7 Supreme Arbiters was processing the implications of what Zixtal proposed, running calculations that had never been necessary before. Finally, Supreme Arbiter Kelthar spoke. If we grant humans complete freedom from the Accords, what prevents other species from demanding the same? What maintains galactic order if every species begins to act according to their own impulses rather than universal law? Perhaps, Zixtal said carefully, galactic order shouldn't be our primary concern. Perhaps we should be more concerned with galactic growth, galactic happiness, galactic aliveness. The heresy of his words would have been unthinkable mere cycles ago. Now they felt like the most natural thing he had ever said. You propose to experiment with the stability of known civilization, Supreme Arbiter Veldun accused. I propose to admit that our experiment in absolute order has already failed, Zixtal countered. Not catastrophically, not dramatically, but completely. We've achieved perfect stagnation, perfect sterility, perfect death in life. Supreme Arbiter Lixdal rose from her position, her crystalline form casting strange patterns of light across the chamber walls. This proposal violates every principle of Vex-Thul governance. It contradicts 17,000 cycles of social evolution. It risks everything we have built. Everything we have built, Zixtal replied, is a beautiful cage. And I am tired of being beautiful and caged when I could be imperfect and free. The words came from somewhere so deep inside him that they surprised even himself. Around the chamber he could see something unprecedented happening, doubt flickering across the Supreme Arbiter's features like cracks in perfect crystal. Supreme Arbiter Mexthor spoke the question that hung unasked in the air. What happens to us if we acknowledge that the humans may be right? What happens to our society, our identity, our entire conception of what it means to be Vex-Thul? We learn to be alive, Zixtal said simply. We learn to grow. We learn to change. We learn to be imperfect and glorious instead of perfect and empty. The debate that followed lasted another full day. The 7 Supreme Arbiters argued, calculated, processed, and analyzed until their bioluminescent forms dimmed with exhaustion, another unprecedented event in their rigidly controlled lives. But in the end, the data was undeniable. Human happiness indices consistently exceeded Vex-Thul efficiency ratings in terms of actual results. Human innovation continued to accelerate while Vex-Thul development had plateaued millennia ago. Human societies, for all their chaos, were growing stronger, while Vex-Thul civilization was slowly crystallizing into permanent stasis. The vote was closer than anyone could have imagined. 4 in favor, 3 opposed. By the narrowest of margins, Supreme Arbiter Kelthar announced, this council grants humanity complete exemption from all galactic compliance accords. They are free to act according to their nature without restriction or oversight. The words echoed through the chamber, then beyond it through communication channels that carried the news to every Vexthol world, every monitoring station, every compliance office across the galaxy. For the first time in 17,000 cycles, a species was completely, unconditionally free. The reactions were immediate and unprecedented. On human colonies, the news was received with celebrations that could be heard from orbit. Captain Sarah Chen, upon learning that her ship was no longer bound by compliance protocols, immediately announced plans for a relief mission to the war-torn Zerion system, a journey that would have required 14 different permits under the old system. Human traders began negotiating deals that prioritized mutual benefit over regulatory compliance, leading to economic partnerships that previous law would have forbidden. Human scientists started sharing data freely with any species that could benefit from it, creating collaborative research projects across ideological and territorial boundaries. But the most significant reaction came from an unexpected source. Within hours of the announcement, Vexthul citizens began filing formal requests for clarification. The questions were simple but profound. If humans could act according to their nature, what about Vexthul nature? If regulations could be set aside for one species, what was the actual foundation of law for any species? The first crack appeared on Vexthul Prime, when Junior Arbiter Tixlel requested permission to delay her assigned mating cycle in order to explore personal compatibility preferences, a concept that had been absent from Vexthul society for so long that there were no protocols to address it. The second crack came when a group of Vexthul engineers proposed modifying standard architectural plans to include aesthetic improvements rather than purely functional designs. The third crack came when young Vexthul began gathering in unauthorized groups to discuss feelings about their assigned roles, feelings being another concept that had been regulated out of their society. Within a week of granting humans complete freedom, the Vexthul found themselves confronting a question they had never expected to face. What happened when a society built on absolute order encountered the possibility of choice? High Arbiter Zixtal, monitoring the cascade of changes from his chambers, felt something he had never experienced before: satisfaction. Not the satisfaction of duty fulfilled or regulations properly enforced, but the deep, warm satisfaction of seeing something grow and change and become more than it had been. For 17,000 cycles, the Vexthul had believed that freedom led inevitably to chaos, and chaos led inevitably to destruction. But watching human space explode with innovation, cooperation, and joy, Zixtal began to understand a different truth. Freedom didn't lead to chaos. It led to growth. And growth, even when it was messy and unpredictable and sometimes painful, was the difference between existing and living. The humans were free now, completely and unconditionally. But as reports continued to flood in of human achievements, human connections, human dreams being realized across the galaxy, Zixtal realized that the real question wasn't what humanity would do with their freedom. The real question was what the rest of the galaxy would do when they saw what freedom could accomplish. Change, once started, was remarkably difficult to stop, and for the first time in his existence, Zixtal found himself hoping it wouldn't be stopped at all. The galaxy was about to discover what happened when you let growth replace stagnation, when you let joy replace mere efficiency, when you let love replace mere compliance. And Zixtal suspected it was going to be beautiful, chaotic, and completely wonderful. 5 standard cycles after the Great Liberation, as historians would later call it, the galaxy was unrecognizable. Former High Arbiter Zixtal, he had abandoned his title after the first cycle, choosing instead to be called simply Zix, stood in what had once been the Grand Council chamber. The sterile crystalline walls now bore irregular patterns of colored light that shifted according to the emotional states of those present. Young Vexthul had discovered they could influence their bioluminescent displays consciously, creating art with their own bodies. "The latest reports from the Outer Rim are extraordinary," said Nixia, formerly Third Arbiter Nixvel, her voice carrying melodic undertones that would have been unthinkable under the old regulations. "The human Deltan colony ships have successfully terraformed the entire Kepler system. They're calling it the Garden Worlds." Zix felt that now familiar warmth of satisfaction, though these days he had learned to recognize it as something more complex. Pride mixed with wonder, accomplishment seasoned with anticipation. The humans had taught them names for emotions they hadn't even known they possessed. "What makes these reports extraordinary isn't just the terraforming," Nixia continued, her form shifting through subtle hues of excitement. "It's the method. 17 different species working together, sharing resources and knowledge freely. The Zephyrians contributed their atmospheric processors, the Andromedans provided soil enhancement technology, even the Crystalline Collective offered their mineral extraction expertise." Free collaboration, Zix mused, a concept that still felt revolutionary even after 5 cycles of observing it. No treaties, no compliance requirements, no oversight committees, just beings working together because they want to help. The transformation had begun immediately after the human liberation, but no one had anticipated how quickly it would spread. It started with small requests: a Vexthul artist asking to modify their assigned dwelling, a young engineer proposing an inefficient but beautiful design, a philosopher questioning whether perfect order was actually perfect. But the real catalyst had been contact with free humanity. When human ships began arriving at Vexthul worlds without compliance restrictions, they brought something that regulations had filtered out for millennia: genuine human nature. They brought music that made Vexthul bodies resonate with harmonics they didn't know they could produce. They brought stories that awakened imagination centers in Vexthul brains that had been dormant for generations. They brought laughter, spontaneous, infectious, joyful laughter that spread through Vexthul populations like a beneficial virus. Within 2 cycles, young Vexthul were requesting to travel with human crews, not as compliance officers or cultural observers, but as friends and partners and fellow explorers. "The Andromedans have submitted their formal request," Nixia announced, pulling Zix from his memories. "They want to abandon the conformity protocols entirely. They've been watching human space for 4 cycles now, and their productivity reports show that free human collaboration has outperformed regulated Andromedan efficiency by factors they can't ignore." Zix nodded, unsurprised. The Andromedans had been the second species to request modification of their compliance requirements, though they'd initially asked only for limited flexibility in cultural expression. That was 3 cycles ago. Now they wanted complete freedom from the system that had defined galactic civilization since before recorded history. And the others? The Zephyrian Trade Collective has already begun operating under modified protocols. The Deltan Republic formally withdrew from the Accords last cycle. Even the Crystalline Collective, the most rigid species we've ever encountered, has started allowing what they call creative mineral formations in their cities. The changes weren't happening in isolation. As each species gained freedom from the old systems, they began working more closely with humans, and through that contact, they discovered capabilities they'd never been allowed to develop. The Andromedans, freed from their conformity requirements, had begun creating art that expressed their unique multidimensional perception. The resulting sculptures were impossible for other species to fully comprehend, but they were breathtakingly beautiful in ways that purely functional design could never achieve. The Zephyrians had discovered that their natural wind-song communications could be developed into music, and their compositions could induce emotional states in other species that promoted healing and growth. The Deltans, no longer restricted to designated territorial boundaries, had begun establishing colonies specifically designed as gathering places for multiple species, cosmopolitan worlds where different cultures could interact and learn from each other. Even the crystalline collective had started growing structures that served no functional purpose beyond beauty, their crystal cities becoming works of art that could be seen from space. But the most profound changes were happening in the spaces between species. "Show me the latest human collaborative network reports," Zix requested. Nixia activated the chamber's display system, which now showed information in flowing, organic patterns rather than rigid grid structures. The data that emerged was staggering. Human-facilitated joint projects had produced technological advances that exceeded the combined achievements of the previous 1,000 cycles under regulated cooperation. The FTL communication breakthrough that allowed real-time conversation across galactic distances. The universal translation matrix that didn't just convert languages, but conveyed emotional and cultural context. The terraforming techniques that could make worlds habitable for multiple species simultaneously. But the most remarkable developments weren't technological, they were social. "Look at this," Nixia highlighted a section of the report. "The human colony ship Harmony has a crew of 847 individuals from 23 different species, not assigned there by compliance directives, not serving according to treaty obligations, but choosing to work together because they enjoy each other's company and believe in their mission." Zix studied the crew manifests with fascination. Humans working alongside Vexthul, who had abandoned their rigid social protocols. Andromedans collaborating with Deltans on projects that would have required decades of negotiation under the old system. Zephyrians and crystalline entities sharing quarters and apparently becoming what the humans called friends. What's their mission? They're heading to the void regions, areas too dangerous for regulated exploration. They want to find new worlds not for colonization or resource extraction, but because, and I quote, "there might be people out there who need help, and besides, exploration is really cool." Zix felt something that might have been nostalgia for a future he'd never imagined. Under the old system, the void regions would have remained unexplored indefinitely, too risky, too expensive, too unpredictable for regulated society to justify. But free humans, working with freely choosing allies from dozens of species, were venturing into the unknown simply because they wanted to see what was there. And the results? They've made first contact with 6 previously unknown species. 3 have already requested to join the collaborative network. 2 are planning to establish cultural exchange programs. The 6th... Nixia paused, her bioluminescent form shifting through patterns of amazement. The 6th was dying. Their sun was going nova, and they had no FTL technology, no way to evacuate their population. Under the old protocols, we would have classified them as a statistical inevitability, regrettable but not our responsibility. But the Harmony crew coordinated the largest rescue operation in galactic history. 47 ships from 12 different species, working without any official authorization, managed to evacuate the entire population, 4.2 million beings, in less than 2 standard days. Zix felt his emotional displays cycling through patterns he still didn't have names for. Under Vexthul rule, those 4.2 million beings would have died, while committees determined whether rescue operations fell within compliance parameters. Where are they now? The rescued population? They've established 3 new colonies in human collaborative space, but here's the interesting part. They're not just living there, they're contributing. Their unique biotechnology has already led to medical advances that will benefit dozens of species. Their artistic traditions are being integrated into collaborative cultural projects. Their children are learning alongside human, Vexthul, Andromedan, and Deltan children in the first truly multi-species educational systems. The transformation was accelerating, and Zix was beginning to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. Not just the collapse of an old system, but the emergence of something entirely new. "What are the humans calling it now?" he asked. "The Free Galaxy Initiative," Nixia replied. though most humans just call it the way things should be. The way things should be. Such a simple phrase, but it contained a revolution in thinking. Under Vexthul rule, the question had always been, what are the regulations? Under the Free Galaxy Initiative, the question was, what would be wonderful? There's something else, Nixia said, her patterns shifting to convey excitement mixed with uncertainty. Ambassador Rodriguez wants to meet with you. Elena Rodriguez, the human who had first challenged the fundamental assumptions of galactic civilization. Zix had not seen her since the day she'd asked him when he'd last done something simply because he wanted to. The question that had started his own transformation. She's here. She arrived this morning with a delegation from the Free Galaxy Council. They're planning something they call the next step, but they won't discuss details until they can meet with you personally. Zix felt anticipation building in his consciousness, another emotion he'd discovered during his liberation. Then let's not keep them waiting. They found Elena and her delegation in what had once been the Compliance Monitoring Center. The sterile rows of surveillance equipment had been replaced with comfortable seating areas where beings from different species could interact naturally. Humans sat alongside Vexthul, whose bioluminescent forms created gentle lighting. Andromedans curved around Deltan families in formations that somehow conveyed both protection and openness. Elena rose as Zix approached, and he noticed she was moving more slowly than he remembered. "Hi, Arbiter," she said with a smile that held more warmth than entire Vexthul cities had once contained. "Though I suppose it's just Zix now?" "Elena," he replied, clasping her hand in the human gesture he'd learned to appreciate. "Yes, just Zix, though I sometimes think of myself as the former High Arbiter who learned how to live." Her smile deepened. "That's exactly what I hope to hear, because what I want to propose requires someone who understands both systems, the one we've left behind and the one we're building." She gestured to a comfortable seating arrangement, and they settled in with the easy informality that would have been scandalous under the old protocols. "5 cycles ago, you gave humanity complete freedom," Elena began. "But we've learned something important since then. Freedom isn't just about being left alone to do what you want. Real freedom is about having the ability to help others achieve their own potential." Zix felt understanding beginning to dawn. "The next step." "The next step," Elena confirmed. "We want to formally invite every species in the galaxy to join the Free Galaxy Initiative, not as subjects or even as allies, but as partners in building something that's never existed before. A truly free galactic civilization based on voluntary cooperation, mutual aid, and the simple principle that every being deserves the chance to grow into their best self." The proposal was staggering in its scope and ambition. "Every species?" "Every species," Elena confirmed. "Even the ones we haven't met yet. Even the ones that might not want to join immediately. Freedom includes the freedom to say no, to take time, to choose your own path. And you want us, the former Vexthul leadership, to help coordinate this?" "We want you to help design it," Elena corrected. "Your people understand organization, planning, large-scale coordination. We humans understand motivation, innovation, adaptation. Together, with input from every species that wants to participate, we can create something that combines the best of order with the best of freedom." Zix felt something shifting in his consciousness that he finally had a name for. Hope. Not hope for return to the way things had been, not hope for better regulation or more efficient compliance, but hope for a future so bright with possibility that it made his bioluminescent form cycle through patterns of pure joy. What would this look like? "We don't know yet," Elena admitted with characteristic human honesty. "That's part of what makes it wonderful. We're going to figure it out together, make mistakes together, grow together. We're going to build a galaxy where beings help each other, not because they're required to, but because it feels good to help." where innovation happens because people are excited about possibilities, not because they're trying to meet quotas, where art and music and stories flow freely between species because beauty is meant to be shared. Around them, the delegation began sharing their own visions. A young Andromedan spoke about communities where beings could explore their nature without restriction. A Deltan elder described cooperation based on affection rather than obligation. A crystalline entity demonstrated communication patterns that conveyed pure emotional truth rather than filtered information. But it was a Vexthul youth, barely past formation age, who articulated what they were all feeling. We want to build a galaxy where every being can ask themselves, what would make me happy, and then have the freedom to pursue that happiness as long as it doesn't prevent others from pursuing theirs. The simplicity and profundity of the statement struck Zix like a revelation. For 17,000 cycles, Vexthul civilization had been built on the question, what is required? Now they were proposing to rebuild galactic civilization around the question, what would make us happy? When do we begin? Zix asked. Elena's smile could have powered a small star. We already have. As if summoned by her words, reports began flowing into the chamber from across the galaxy. Species that had been isolated for millennia were requesting contact with the Free Galaxy Initiative. Colony ships were launching not to establish territorial claims, but to create new forms of community. Scientists from dozens of species were sharing discoveries freely, leading to breakthroughs that exceeded all previous achievements. But the most remarkable report came from the edge of known space, where the human ship Harmony had encountered something unprecedented. They found them, Nixia announced, her voice filled with wonder. The ancients, the species that left the ruins on the dead worlds, the ones we thought were extinct. They're not extinct. They've been hiding, waiting. Waiting for what? For a galaxy mature enough to understand that true advancement isn't about control or power or efficiency. It's about growth, connection, joy, and the courage to help each other become more than we could ever be alone. The ancient message was simple but profound. Welcome to the community of truly free beings. We've been waiting 17,000 cycles for you to learn what freedom actually means. Now the real adventure begins. Zix looked around the chamber at beings from dozens of species working together, not because regulations required it, not because treaties demanded it, but because they wanted to build something beautiful together. He saw humans teaching Vexthul how to laugh, Andromedans showing Deltans new forms of art, crystalline entities sharing harmonics that made everyone's bioluminescence dance in synchronized patterns of pure happiness. This was what freedom had produced, not chaos, not destruction, not the collapse of civilization, but its transformation into something wonderful beyond imagining. For the first time in his existence, Zix understood what humans meant when they talked about hope for the future. They weren't hoping to survive. They were hoping to thrive, to grow, to become more than they had ever dreamed possible. And now, the entire galaxy was learning to hope the same way. The universe's strictest race had given humans complete freedom, and in return, humans had given the galaxy something far more valuable. The knowledge that freedom, when shared freely, multiplied into something that could only be called love. The real adventure was just beginning.